Good afternoon, spaceflight enthusiasts, and welcome to another episode of The Angry Astronaut. And once again, I'm going to be talking what, at least in my opinion, are cold, hard facts and possibilities, indeed, maybe even realities, that NASA or anybody else who's interested in seeing human beings return to the moon anytime soon, at least people in the West returning to the moon anytime soon, should seriously be looking at. Before I start talking about any of that, though, really also need to talk about the topic that I've been covering lately and my decision as to whether or not I should really continue covering SpaceX at all. The views on my Starship videos have continued to plunge, and that is not at all surprising to me. I'm actually kind of surprised it didn't happen earlier, because I've taken the unenviable position of neither being 100% in favor of SpaceX, Elon, Starship, and everything he has to say about it, and about what Starship might represent to spaceflight in the very, very near future. Instead, I've been a lot more conservative in terms of how quickly I think Starship is really going to transform the spaceflight industry. So I haven't gone that far over to one side, and also I haven't gone to the other side. To the Elon haters out there who talk shit about Starship continuously, regardless of what it happens to accomplish, regardless of the amazing things that happen during these test flights, in spite of the incredible theoretical capabilities of Starship. Sure, hasn't realized them yet, but I think it probably will. I've instead taken I think is anyway a middle position, and just about everybody on both sides disagrees and thinks that I have taken a position radically in support of one side or the other, which again, I don't think I have. But nevertheless, the views are clearly supporting that theory. As my views continue to plunge for these videos, it's obvious that I'm losing my viewership when we're talking about either SpaceX supporters or SpaceX detractors. All that having been said, though, should I continue covering this topic? Yes, I absolutely should. There are thousands of people who still watch this content who seem to think that it's worth watching. And I think the reason they're watching it is because they want to see some harsh realism. They want to hear some hard facts from somebody who doesn't necessarily hate SpaceX, hate Starship, hate everything that it represents, but at the same time is not so overwhelmingly in support of SpaceX and Starship that they lose sight of reality. So, all that having been said, even though the top 20 videos that I've released in the history of this channel, not one of those videos is Starship related. Actually, it's number 21, and that was my video about the SN11 flight. So, Starship has never been the most popular topic I've ever talked about on this channel, but nevertheless, I think that it's extremely newsworthy, and I should continue talking about this topic regardless, because there are people who want to hear my point of view. All that having been said, though, we need to be asking ourselves a very critical question now after Flight 7. Talking 7 flights of the same rocket. Granted, the upper stage was a big, big modification. So where are we now? We're dealing with a rocket whose booster is looking very promising, looking very likely that we could get full reusability on the booster soon. But then again, can't even say that for certain, because we've only seen one Raptor engine reused thus far and no boosters being reused. Hopefully, this one that they captured recently, there's some rumors that the 9th test flight of Starship will involve a reuse of that booster. So hopefully that's the case. Hopefully we'll start to see reusability very soon. But even if that is indeed the case, we are seeing an orbiter that is a very, very long ways away from being reused. Indeed, it is a long ways away from being a functional, mature system for deploying things into orbit. And here we are, with an Artemis contract and expectations that SpaceX is somehow going to be able to put human beings on the surface of the moon, astronauts safely on the surface of the moon by 2027. I think at this point, all of us realize that that is in fact impossible. And so the question needs to be asked then, when will Starship realistically be ready? I think it's going to be a long time indeed before Starship gets from where it is now to the ability to being reused over and over again. We're talking the orbiter now, carrying out 10 refueling missions, which is the minimum that is necessary to get Starship, Lunar Starship that is, to the moon, doing all of those things in rapid succession in order to complete a successful Artemis mission. And although I still continue to believe that Starship will replace rockets like SLS, that Starship will transform the future of the space industry, what happens if it can't do the job that it needs to do for Artemis soon enough? Do we have another alternative? Well, yes, we do, but it has to be done in a bit of an inventive and innovative fashion, using the tools that NASA currently has at its disposal. So first of all, here's some good news. We already have the capability of reaching lunar orbit with the rockets that NASA has at its disposal. We can get 95% of the way to our destination without having to add anything new. And to cover a little bit more information about the future of SLS and why we absolutely need to keep it, I'm going to read an article in spacenews.com entitled, "Do the Space Launch System and Orion have a future under the Trump administration?" And by the way, this was written on January 15th, before the whole issue with the Starship Flight 7 and everything associated with that anomaly. Quote, "Since the recent presidential election, there's been a flurry of speculation about the future of NASA's Moon to Mars plans during the second Trump administration. Will we accelerate plans to return to the Moon and Mars? Will NASA be restructured? And how will these plans align with the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE?" The speculation has been particularly intense regarding the future of the Space Launch System, or SLS, and the Orion crew vehicle. Some pundits have called for the outright cancellation of SLS and Orion, citing the cost of these vehicles and delays in their development. However, the cancellation of these vehicles may be premature. I'm going to go ahead and say that it's definitely premature. These calls are largely based on the impressive success of SpaceX and the significant influence of SpaceX CEO Elon Musk within the coming administration. While SpaceX has unquestionably become an indispensable company, and Starship has already achieved some remarkable milestones, there remain many obstacles to overcome before it can be counted on to be able to venture into deep space and land safely on another planetary body. If it fulfills the capabilities that SpaceX has promised, the Starship launch system would undoubtedly help to radically transform access to space and the future of human permanence beyond Earth. Nevertheless, this does not mean that we no longer need SLS and Orion, at least in the short term. We can certainly debate whether SLS and Orion will or should be a long-term element of our deep space exploration fleet. As Starship, New Glenn, and other systems come online, they may well prove to be better suited for our ambitious goals. But we have not yet crossed that threshold, and we don't know when or if it will be crossed. The SLS Orion launch system currently works, as proven by the Artemis 1 mission, which launched in late 2022 with an uncrewed Orion spacecraft flying around the moon and returning safely to the Earth. In addition, we have already built most of the hardware required for the Artemis 2 and 3 missions, which will be crewed missions. Let's use that hardware to achieve some near-term victories in space. Even with NASA's recently modified Artemis schedule, Artemis 2 will launch a crew around the moon in the first half of 2026, and if Starship is also ready, we can conduct the Artemis 3 mission, landing a crew on the moon in 2027, although I continue to say that at this point looks quite impossible. Otherwise, we will scrap functional hardware that the U.S. taxpayers have already paid for, hardware that would then likely set a new record for the most expensive museum displays in history. This is what happened at the end of the Apollo era, with Saturn V rockets that never flew now residing in several museums around the country. At the completion of the Apollo program, the U.S. still had 3 complete Saturn V rockets and 1 partially completed rocket in its fleet. Although Congress had directed NASA to maintain them for other potential missions, this never happened. Rather than being used to advance our capabilities and understanding of space, they became impressive museum displays. Do we want this to be the future of SLS if we can instead get some value for the enormous investment made to date? If we're serious about beating China back to the moon and on to Mars, let's use every tool in our belt and elevate the national priority of these objectives, regardless of which launch and crew systems will ultimately reign supreme. The incoming administration and Congress should move quickly forward to execute the upcoming Artemis missions. At the same time, they must also mandate NASA and industry to construct a path forward that will ensure that the U.S. and our partners establish permanence on the moon this decade and onto Mars no later than the mid-2030s. Okay, so all of that is a compelling reason to keep SLS around, but what about actually landing on the moon? What happens if Starship just doesn't come to maturity fast enough or isn't able to build out the necessary infrastructure with all of that refueling to get astronauts to the moon in a realistic time frame? Can the Origin Blue Moon lander handle the job instead? Well, I'll tell you, that's going to be a very tall order for Blue Origin, especially given their reputation for the step-by-step, ferociously philosophy. It takes forever for Blue Origin to bring anything to maturity, and even though New Glenn is finally in service now, albeit not as a reusable rocket, but definitely as a rocket that can lift very large and very heavy payloads to impressive orbits, Blue Moon has yet to even pass its preliminary design review. And that's the case for Lunar Starship as well. The only HLS solution, by the way, that's passed its preliminary design review is the Dynetics Alpaca. The one solution that NASA didn't select is the solution that has actually achieved a higher level of maturity way back in 2021. But I have bitched enough about that mistake. Let's go ahead and talk about Blue Moon and its architecture. It is nearly as complicated as Starship when you come right down to it, although not nearly as many flights. First of all, this requires 2 launches of New Glenn to assemble something called the Lunar Transporter, which, by the way, includes a refueling tanker as well. This is something that's being built by Lockheed Martin, something we've yet to see an animation for, and something that probably isn't going to achieve a high level of maturity for quite some time. Then a 3rd New Glenn launch docks Blue Moon to the Lunar Transporter once both vehicles have reached the near rectilinear halo orbit where the Lunar Gateway is going to be hanging out. Then the Lunar Transporter pushes the Blue Moon lander into a docking position with the Lunar Gateway space station, and at the same time, the transporter transfers enough hydrolox fuel into the lunar lander for it to make a successful landing on the lunar surface and then to return to the Lunar Gateway. Once all of this is accomplished, the Lunar Transporter and the Blue Moon lander will theoretically be in a reusable configuration where they can be used again, assuming, of course, that you can get fuel to this assembly, because all of the hydrolox fuel that the transporter had on board will presumably have been transferred to Blue Moon for the lunar mission. So, kind of a complicated solution, but not requiring 11 or 12 launches, so not too bad. But one of the biggest problems, one of the most enormous barriers that exist right now is the fact that this Lunar Transporter doesn't exist, and Lockheed Martin doesn't exactly build things overnight, so I don't see how Blue Moon is going to be in any kind of position to land astronauts on the lunar surface before 2030. 2030, and it may take considerably longer than that. But there's a way around it. Blue Moon has actually been under construction and under development by Blue Origin for quite some time. And this is especially the case with the Blue Moon Mark I. It's a cargo variant of the larger Mark II that's designed to carry human beings. The Mark I standing about 8 meters tall with a 3-meter diameter and a fueled mass of just over 21 metric tons and a payload capacity reaching about 3 metric tons. And this Mark I version of Blue Moon is supposed to start some uncrewed missions to the lunar surface as early as this year and no later than next year. The flight computers, avionics, reaction control system, and the power system are all supposed to be very similar to what's going to be used on the Mark II. All of that being the case, the Mark II has probably made a substantial amount of progress at this point and could theoretically be ready for service as early as 2028 or 2029. Why? Well, because the uncrewed demonstration flight of Blue Moon is scheduled for 2027. Now, I have zero confidence that Lockheed Martin is going to have their cislunar transporter built by 2027, but theoretically, they don't have to. The total mass of the Blue Moon, the HLS version of Blue Moon that is, has to be substantially less than 45 metric tons because that's the maximum amount of mass that New Glenn can get up to low Earth orbit. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure it's going to be substantially less than that. Now, how much can SLS, the Block 1B cargo version anyway, how much can that get to the moon? Well, the Block 1B cargo configuration replaces the Orion with a large payload shroud, including an 8.4 meter diameter and a volume of 989 cubic meters, more than large enough to completely contain the Blue Moon lander. And it is also capable of shooting 42 metric tons to the moon, and I am completely confident that even a fully fueled Blue Moon lander is not going to weigh more than 42 metric tons. All of that being the case, then, a Block 1B SLS could deliver the Blue Moon to cislunar space without the Lockheed Martin transporter. So what does a modified Artemis 3 using Blue Moon sound like if we're talking about this kind of solution? Well, one SLS launch, the older SLS that is, to deliver the Orion to cislunar space or to the near rectilinear halo orbit that it needs to go to, and another SLS to deliver Blue Moon to the same orbit. Orion docks with Blue Moon. Blue Moon makes its way down to the lunar surface. The astronauts stay there for a few days and then make their way back to the Orion to dock with it for the journey home. So we are essentially eliminating the need for the cislunar transporter, eliminating 2 New Glenn launches, and replacing the New Glenn launches with one SLS flight. Now, obviously, this is also going to require that the Block 1B SLS reach maturity, but a good portion of that rocket is already built and already developed. It is the mobile launch tower that requires a little bit more time to reach maturity, but at the same time, I have a high degree of confidence that SLS Block 1B can reach service by 2028 or 2029 at the latest, meaning the only thing that could theoretically hold this mission up is Blue Moon not reaching maturity by then. And once again, that's the part of this puzzle that Blue Origin has been working on the longest and the most. They have been working on a human-rated lander for years, even prior to the time that they got the NASA contract. Now, of course, I hear many of you saying that using a second SLS for a single lunar mission is both wasteful and an outdated way of doing things, and I happen to agree. But at the same time, if we compare it to the alternatives, SLS actually gets the job in a more simple and straightforward fashion with less infrastructure, less complexity. The only advantage, really, that the other options have is expense. If you take the expense factor out of it, SLS is actually a pretty damn good solution for taking care of this problem. We're talking 2 launches to get a pretty sizable lunar lander down to the lunar surface, something that could definitely establish a permanent presence on the moon considering its cargo capacity. Blue Moon can carry up to 20 metric tons to the lunar surface in reusable configuration, and that is more than enough to get the beginnings of a lunar base going, especially for only 2 to 4 astronauts at a time, which is all that Artemis calls for all the way through the Artemis 10 mission. So if Lunar Starship doesn't come through as it's contracted to, and by the way, that is the only reason that I'm giving here as to why we should be considering this alternative. If Starship does not mature as quickly as it has to in order to beat China to the moon, this is an alternative that just might work. And even though Blue Origin is notorious for not getting jobs done quickly or with a sense of urgency, and even though SLS is going to be a very expensive alternative, in my opinion, that is much better than not getting to the moon at all until the 2030s. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and also please consider supporting this channel on Patreon. I have ambitions to go to Australia, to go to New Zealand to visit my viewers there, and also to go to Shetland to cover the first ever orbital launch attempt from Western Europe. All of those things are only going to be possible if I receive about 1% of my subscribers becoming Patreon supporters, which I think we can definitely do. So please have a look at the description. And until next time, stay angry about space.